Hello everyone, this is your host Professor Reha, back with another Grim Dawn class examination. This one is the Templar, which is the Arcanist Oathkeeper combination. Now, as usual, this is intended to help those who either are intending to improv this class, don't have any items for this class, or are looking for some ideas to create their own build with whatever items they happen to have on hand at the time. I'll be covering items in a future video, in a future series. Now, the Templar has primarily only two approaches, really, to builds, with some specifics based on equipment. So basically, there are two broad ways you can build this, and each one of these has a subdivision depending on whether or not you're using a shield, which matters a lot to the Templar. Now, the first one I want to talk about is actually the less commonly talked about one, which is the widely feared Cold Lightning Templar. Now, this may confuse a lot of people, but the Oathkeeper does all of this fire damage. Yes, it does. Absolutely. Except, that's not all the Oathkeeper does. There's a couple of things here that Star Pact can really get done. First off, a certain amount of your physical damage is being converted to cold damage. Second off, you actually have the ability to increase elemental damage in general. So what Star Pact offers you is boosts to cold and lightning damage. The Oathkeeper offers you boosts to fire damage. And so you'll have basically this weird, slightly influx mix of cold, lightning, and fire damage, with which one being your most damaging, depending entirely on what you happen to have equipped at the time. So you're actually broadly increasing all three of your elemental damage types, and doing some physical damage, internal trauma damage besides. While some of that physical damage is being converted to cold damage, so a decent amount is left over as well. The nice thing about Star Pact is it is a flat 15% physical damage being converted, so you're not going to lose even a majority of your physical damage. This is a mere portion of your physical damage, and it doesn't even touch internal trauma damage, which is fine. So internal trauma and physical do become your kind of secondary damage type. Now, there is a mild problem that you're going to find with ethereals. Obviously, against regular ethereals, your physical damage and internal trauma damage is going to carry you through, but against certain bosses and heroes, you are going to have a rough time, because there are certain bosses and heroes that will maintain a decently strong elemental resistance and have some physical resistance as well. So there are going to be situations where you're going to do decently well against ethereals up until you come against some specific hero or boss, and then you're going to really see your damage output slow down against them, and that's going to be why. They just happen to have some physical resistance to counter your backup damage type. But overall, other than that specific situation in which the Templar has a bit of a problem, the Star Pact Templar at least specifically, you're pretty much fine in all other ways, and you do have a couple of abilities that you can still splash in Aether damage, and we'll get into that. But how you approach Star Pact, what skills you really want to be looking at, is going to depend quite a decent bit on what you want to equip. Essentially speaking, with Star Pact, you have three good options. None of them are ranged. The Templar just doesn't often do well with ranged. Again, there are items out there that change this, and if you want to use ranged, you absolutely can. I will cover that, but keep in mind that it's absolutely not... You are limiting your skill selection a little bit if you choose to go with ranged, but we'll cover that. Now, the first thing I want to talk about actually is something I've touched kind of briefly in a focused build video on the Spin to Win, but you can make a very interesting Spin to Win with Star Pact and two-handed weapons, which is about the only way I run two-handed weapons with the Templar. Now, what do I mean? Well, I mean, Eye of Reckoning. Now, initially, this does fire and physical damage. This, of course, because of the Star Pact, will be physical, cold, and fire damage, and then when you get into Soul Fire, that's more cold damage, more physical damage, and some lightning damage. Okay, great. But you can make an absolutely fantastic Spin to Win using this. Now, if you're going to Spin to Win this, you're going to first off max... I'm actually going to demonstrate the points here, because Spin to Win is a rather famous build, and this is a very unusual approach to it. I will freely admit that. So you're going to go with that, right? You're going to go with Maven's Sphere. You're going to go with Mental Alacrity. You're going to go with Inner Focus. You're going to go into a Delicious Arcane Will. You're going to go into Presence of Virtue. I almost forgot about this. You're actually not going to go into Resilience because you don't have that much of a self-heal in this particular scenario. But you are going to go into Guardian of Empyrean. Actually, we are going to need this. I forgot about this. I always forget about the Guardian of Empyrean. Go into Celestial Presence. And at this particular point, you can either go full into Haven. I don't usually because there's just really not a huge demand for this. You can use Ascension. What I'm usually going to do is Conversion, because you really don't want to be slowed down or stopped while you're spinning for victory. And then I'll actually... Sometimes I'll run Iskandra's Elemental Exchange, just for a kind of backup, because it does increase your energy regeneration, which can really help with this. Alternatively, you can go into Mirror of Arioctes. It depends on how much of a problem you're going to have with surviving, but I will usually get this specifically for that energy regeneration, even if you're not necessarily using Iskandra's Elemental Exchange, because it's primarily affecting your weapon damage, so it's just not a huge boost otherwise, but it's mostly for the elemental damage. But this is a fairly enjoyable spin-to-win variety. We have 2 points, might as well throw them into Mirror of Arioctes, whatever. So this is quite the interesting, sort of quasi-gambling spin to win. Now, this isn't my favorite way of playing spin to win because you don't really have a whole lot of methods on which to heal yourself. You're going to have to turn to constellations for that. Ghoulish Hunger, for example. But basically, the idea is, I'm going to have to spin to win you to death before you kill me, is what this comes down to. So it's a very high-risk, high-reward type of spin to win. Again, not my favorite because it doesn't really have any kind of internal sustain, but it can be incredibly potent. Just do keep in mind that, yeah, you're going to have a bit of a problem staying alive during any fight with anything sufficiently resistant to elemental damage. That's going to be really rough. So just keep that in mind. But that's not the only way you can run Star Pact Templars. Now, the usual way you go about this is skills, obviously. And you have a couple of good skills that you can access. I, again, tend to build Alexa's Flash Freeze, which you can already probably figure how impactful that can be when combined with a lot of Oathkeeper skills. You've got an absolutely staggering variety of skills you can use here. You could run Alexa's Flash Freeze, go into Iskandra's Elemental Exchange, and then run Righteous Fervor. You can do this with a shield or an offhand or whatever you stinking want. If you do have a shield, you decide to go with the shield. Obviously, Safeguard is fantastic, but you don't necessarily need it. In all honesty, it's just something you can use. This is about one of the few ways that I will argue that ranged works just fine. You don't really necessarily need to be using a melee weapon. You don't need to be using a shield. You don't need to be using an offhand for this. This is just an auto-attack focused build. Splash in Maven's Sphere and Inner Focus as you choose. If you want to go into Smite, you can do that. If you want to go into Shattering... Well, you can't go into Shattering Smash with that. No, you can't with this one either. No, you can. Yeah, this one requires a shield. This one does not. I get those two mixed up. But you can go into Smite if you want. If you are using the shield, you can go into Shattering Smash and Safeguard, which really helps with your damage output and your survivability. But you do have these options. So it really comes down to how you want to approach this. But this is one of the ways that you can really use a ranged weapon. As much as you like, go for it. I typically use a shield because I do enjoy Safeguard and Shattering Smash. I find them very useful, but this is, if I am going to run a ranged Templar, this is usually how I'm going to run it, just for those reasons. I mean, you've got the elemental damage, you have all of the support for that. It works really well. Alternatively, you could go at this from the skill-based point of view, where instead of using auto attacks with Iskandra's Elemental Exchange and Righteous Fervor, you have a couple of different options. One thing that I really enjoy is a nice judgment where you throw this down, knock them back, and then, enemies are taunted, and then you freeze them afterwards, or freeze them first and judgment them afterwards, totally up to you. You've got all these options, or this will work whether or not you have a shield, but if you are going to use a shield, Aegis of Menhir. Oh my goodness. What basically happens with the combination of Alexa's Flash Freeze and the Aegis of Menhir is what you can't freeze, you can stun, and what you can't stun, you can usually freeze, essentially speaking. Now, there are rare exceptions to this rule, but that's broadly how that's going to work out, and of course you can slap in Safeguard to increase your physical fire and internal trauma damage. That's just a lovely time. But you also don't necessarily need to utilize Alexa's Flash Freeze either. I just find it extremely effective with the Templar for obvious reasons. The fire and the physical resistance going down really helps out Oathkeeper abilities, but you can absolutely go into Kalidor's Tempest instead. The Aether damage will to some extent be converted into cold damage, and the rest remains Aether, which is fine. But if you run Wrath of Agravix, you can either go really heavy into the shield again, which, stun, knockback, whatever, or you can just chain knockback. I don't really like the chain knockback because larger enemies, like the ethereal giants, just aren't going to care about your knockdown attempts. They're going to laugh in your face. Nobody likes to be laughed in their face by giants. It's terribly unpleasant. So I don't usually run this. I do usually run a shield with this, with Wrath of Agravix, so that way I can throw my shield, tackle one enemy specifically, and then just using Wrath of Agravix in my shield, force continuous 1v1s. Now, whether or not I go into Righteous Fervor or some other auto-attacking thing, that's a totally different question. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, it really depends. Sometimes I'll go into Trozan's Sky Shard, and what you can do, which is fairly interesting and surprisingly effective, is, again, using a combination of Wrath of Agravix Kalidor's Tempest to knock enemies away from you, and use your Aegis of Menhir to also slap enemies away from you. You would decrease, by the way, you would take the 30 points out here and just go to here, so you would have 30 extra points to play with. But you would use Aegis of Menhir and Kalidor's Tempest to keep enemies away from you, force a 1v1, but instead of using auto attacks, you can smack them down with Trozan's Sky Shard, which does cold and lightning. You can potentially freeze them if they can be frozen, depends on the target. And just absolutely have a field day with that. Go into maybe Maven's Sphere, or you go into Inner Focus, what have you. You can do that as well, and that turns out to... That works out quite well, actually. Which is a fairly interesting time. Now, finally, you could additionally instead go with an offhand and run Albrecht's Aether Ray, which is going to do a very strange combination of cold, lightning, aether, and fire damage, which is very odd. But what you have a couple of options for this. Now, you can use Alexa's Flash Freeze, you can use you can't use Aegis of Menhir with Albrecht's Aether Ray, pardon me. You can use Judgment, you can use Kalidor's Tempest. But essentially the idea here is you are beaming the enemy, and then once they get close to you, you either are using Kalidor's Tempest, Alexa's Flash Freeze, or Judgment to blast them away from you, so you can keep beaming. Now, whether or not you want to go into Guardian of Empyrean is up to you. These can be very effective. I don't usually run them in this scenario in Albrecht's Aether Ray, because you have to actually max out all the way here, and I find that very expensive, so I usually steer clear of that. Just as a personal preference, I just don't usually run Guardian of Empyrean at this point, because when I'm already putting this many points here, you can throw in Devastation for some extra, because that's fairly devastating. Ha ha ha. Yes, sue me for bad humor. Please don't. Anyways, you can do all of that. You could run Presence of Virtue for the energy regeneration, of course, or you can even use Ascension if you get into melee and you just want to do that retaliation damage. Use Clarity of Purpose to really help you, or you can use this during a Albrecht Aether Ray. That's totally fine, pull this off, beam people, that works too. But overall, Albrecht's Aether Ray doesn't have a lot of coordination kind of intermingling there, so it's just kind of go with whatever really suits you here in this particular situation. I am personally, though, pretty fond of Judgment or Calidor's Tempest. They both operate the same way. It really depends on what your equipment is enhancing at the time. But you can see where there's not really necessarily a whole lot of support. I will almost always run Presence of Virtue with this, because that's energy regen, helps you cast Albrecht's Aether Ray for longer. It's a wonderful time. But it really comes down to which you're enhancing more. And again, sometimes I will build Ascension, because that can be really nice. I'll just activate this really quick, beam for some extra damage. Don't have to worry about ranged enemies hitting you while you're beaming. It's not a bad choice at all. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind. There is actually, I'm actually going to, while we're on the subject of Albrecht's Aether Ray, there is a mild variation here that you can run, which is a very interesting Chaos Vitality Oathkeeper, and in this particular case, you're running some rather interesting things. Now, first off, I'm actually going to, again, demonstrate this with full points. So you're running your Chaos Vitality build here. You're increasing your fire damage. That doesn't really matter, because your fire damage is being converted to acid damage through Path of the Three. So that doesn't really make a huge difference. You're running Summon Guardian of Empyrean, Oluk Scion of Drieg, Oluk Poison Acid Vitality Resistance down. Delicious. Presence of Virtue, love to see it. Alright, what else are we doing here, theoretically speaking? Well, personally, I have a deep preference for Calidor's Tempest, just because you can run Fabric of Reality, increase your Aether and Chaos damage, grab this, and your fire damage is being converted into, of course, as we mentioned earlier, Poison Acid, which is being boosted. You have a knockback that you can run, again, fairly important. And you're splashing in a little bit of lightning damage for those enemies that are resistant to Vitality and Chaos and Poison Acid. You have a few alternatives, but this isn't by any means your only method here either. It's just something I am rather fond of running. But if you really wanted to, actually, you also have the option, which I don't often use because it's fairly expensive, of running Drieg's Reproach here. Now, whether or not you go up to Consecration and Retribution is entirely up to you. But what this essentially offers you is the ability to beam enemies as they approach you, and then auto-attack them. Now, if I'm going to run this, I'm not necessarily usually going to run Calidor's Tempest, for the fairly obvious reason of, if you're knocking them back, then that's absolute nonsense, right? It just doesn't make sense. So you want to go full into this. And then you're running Maven's Sphere. And I usually go Inner Focus. You don't have to, but I really like to. And just 1 point into Mental Alacrity for a bonus 300 energy. Delicious for 1 point, 300 energy? Yes, please. But this is an interesting alternative that almost nobody at all talks about, but it is rather effective. Now, you don't necessarily have to use the Scions of Drieg. It's just, you know, we're already up at this far anyways. They're reducing Poison, Acid, and Vitality resistance. Why wouldn't you want these? This is actually very effective in general. So that's really great as well. If you don't want Presence of Virtue, you can absolutely go into full Mental Alacrity or put those points in Devastation if you really wanted to. You've got some other options. You don't necessarily need to be using that specifically. But it is the Path of the Three Templar. I wasn't originally going to talk about this. I was going to try to save this towards the end of the video. I just saw the opportunity to smoothly integrate it with the Aether Ray. But ultimately, this is a fairly interesting little build that works surprisingly well. Whether you use Calidor's Tempest or Righteous Fervor is entirely a matter of personal interpretation. It depends on which direction you want to take it. Now, speaking of Oathkeeper exclusives, there is a very specific reason why we don't even talk about Divine Mandate. You'll notice I have not talked about it, and that I'm not likely to talk about it. If you're using Divine Mandate with the Templar, it's because you have items that boost that specifically. Because the Arcanist does not have any physical damage. Ooh. So, while you could go into Divine Mandate and you could grab Calidor's Tempest, at that point, if you have Divine Mandate, why wouldn't you take Judgment in that particular circumstance? So you don't need Calidor's Tempest. You might possibly splash an Electro's Flash Freeze for the resistance drops, I say that often, but that's because that is some pretty awesome resistance reductions. So there is that possibility if you're going with the Divine Mandate Oathkeeper. That is Divine Mandate, right? Yeah. Divine Mandate Templar can in fact use Electro's Flash Freeze quite nicely, and you've got the extra damage mitigation of Maven's Sphere, making you nice and tanky. You can run Righteous Fervor and Smite or whatever else, but from a Divine Mandate perspective, you are very likely just running Electro's Flash Freeze, and maybe a couple of other choice abilities, depending on what you're equipped with, what it enhances. Maven's Sphere, of course. Inner Focus is a pretty good time. Reduce this down to the 20 points, so you have 30 points left over that you can spend on other things. Maybe you go into Arcane Will, just for the boosted damage and the energy regeneration. But I don't often use Divine Mandate, because I personally find that I get more use out of the Reckless Power. Because I can convert some of the physical damage out of Templar into Aether damage, which is fairly nice. I mean, this doesn't do any kind of damage conversion at all, whereas I can do a bit more Aether damage and enhance that further through Reckless Power. It also means that Caladora's Tempest is going to hit a bit harder, and I'm also not quite as pseudo-locked into a shield. A Divine Mandate Templar does tend to prioritize shield a little bit more, not necessarily, you know, all the time, but again, if you're utilizing Divine Mandate, you have no reason to go into Caladora's Tempest. There's not really any reason to go into Albrecht's Aether Ray. It just doesn't make sense when you have all of these other things doing specifically physical and fire damage, and there is no conversion. Like I said, Electro's Flash Trace is the only thing that I consistently would use out of a Divine Mandate Templar, and while I have used Divine Mandate Templars in very specific equipment situations, I've never improved one, because it just doesn't... an improv Divine Mandate Templar is just not as flexible as a Reckless Power Templar. So anytime I've run the Divine Mandate Templar, it has been with specific item sets. I'll, again, discuss those later on. So, a lot of the same things with Reckless Power do apply to Divine Mandate, just with a bit more flexibility. If I decide, for example, to go into Virus Might, I can convert some of that into Aether damage, which is really nice. And you've got, of course, Aegis in here. A lot of what applied with Star Pact kind of applies with Reckless Power, just you don't necessarily want to be going into Trozans, because that doesn't really help you that much. Beyond that, pretty much everything goes. If you wanted to, say, go into the Fantastic Auto Attack, you can, absolutely, 100%. Once again, you can use any item you want for this. That really works out well. If you wanted to use an offhand in Albrecht's Aether Ray and use the auto-attacking build, you can absolutely do that. Use this until they get into melee range, and then slap them to death when they get into melee range if you're using a melee weapon. That's totally fine. That is completely acceptable. Or maybe you are using a ranged weapon and you don't want enemies near you. Alright, well, first off, you would probably have this. Alright, use Caladora's Tempest, or alternatively, use Judgment if that's up your alley. You are, again, converting that physical damage into Aether damage, so that ultimately works out. And then this is just more physical damage, which gets converted. Here's some fire damage here. It's just a magical time. And then you don't even need to go into these. You can just go into the abilities. Again, you can go into Judgment if you wanted to. You could go into Virus Might. You can go into the Shield auto-attack build. A lot of what I talked about with the Star Pact crosses over into Reckless Power really nicely, just with the exception of ignore Trozans, basically, because you don't really need that to do high single target damage under Reckless Power. Now, you may have noticed, well, you haven't really talked about Panetti's Replicating Missile. Correct. There are two specific reasons. Well, there's one major reason for that, and that is primarily that in terms of ranged abilities, Albrecht's Aether Ray finds more support between the two classes, between the two masteries, excuse me, than Panetti's really does, because this is fire and lightning damage specifically. This is elemental damage in general, so while it does eventually come to do increased fire and increased lightning damage, or increased electrocute damage specifically, it's just overall, in my personal opinion, not as effective. But there is a specific scenario in which you would want Panetti's. Anytime you want something like Aether Ray in there, but you don't want to use an offhand, Panetti's is the answer. Alright, say you want to be a melee, two-handed wielding lunatic but you don't want to spin to win, but you do want a ranged option. Great, that's fine. And you have already decided, hey, I want to be a devastating, auto-attacking, ranged, wrathful Templar. I want to use the two-handed weapons. I want to absolutely slap the snot right out of anyone who comes near me. Okay, we can work with this. So you want to do your melee two-handed damage. You want enemies to some extent to get close to you. That's fine. But you don't want to use an offhand because you're using a two-handed weapon. Fantastic. We can absolutely work with this. We can go into here. We can go into Panetti's. We can absolutely devolve all of our points into here. Just absolutely devastate large swaths of enemies. And anyone who survives, which is going to be the heroes primarily, or what have you, you can slap down with your melee weapon. Maybe you don't even need Elixir's Flash Freeze. Maybe you don't want that. That's fine. Don't feel obligated to build this. I find it very useful. It's one of my favorite skills. I'll admit to some clear bias there. That's not a problem. But you don't have to use it at all. Go into Inner Focus. Go into Maven Sphere. Throw some points into Arcane Will. Or Mental Alacrity for the energy, for Pete's sakes. Or maybe you don't want Arcane Will. Maybe you want Presence of Virtue. You know, you absolutely can do that. But this is the kind of context in which you would want Panetti's Replicating Missile. You want a ranged response, but you don't want to use an offhand for Albrecht's Aether Ray. Panetti's is your answer. Now, you don't have to put all of your points into it. I just tend to, because just spamming a fully built Panetti's Replicating Missile is hilarious. But you don't have to. But those are the situations with the Templar that you would want to build Panetti's. You want a ranged answer, but you don't want Albrecht's Aether Ray because you're choosing not to use an offhand. Perfectly fine. Panetti's everyone to death. Absolutely. So, and even then, even still, you don't even necessarily need to be using auto attacks. Maybe you want to utilize a ranged... No, that wouldn't make much sense. Maybe you want to do a shield. You want to do a shield build, but you don't want to necessarily devote your time to auto attacks. Alright. Aegis of Men here for the stun, and while the enemies are stunned, you spam missiles at them. And you, of course, have Reckless Power, and that works out extremely well. Let me tell you something. I've run that before. You just throw your shield, spam replicating missiles until your shield throw comes back up, or the enemy becomes unstunned, throw the shield, rinse and repeat. Just absolute chaos. Very effective. And then you can run, if you wanted to, Kalidor's Tempest, usually is what I go with, to blast away enemies that are too close to you. And basically, your weapon is more of a decoration to enhance your damage output than anything else. That's very effective. These are just the examples of when you would want to be considering Panetti's. If you are looking to use an offhand and you're like, alright, I'm going to use Aether Ray because it slaps and it's excellent ranged damage. Yeah, Panetti's is useless in that situation. But what if you're like, well, I want to use a shield and I don't want to lose out on good range damage? Panetti's. It can work really well, regardless of whether you're using auto attacks or you're using skills. It turns out to be an extremely effective ability in those scenarios. So, and again, any context in which you would use Kalidor's Devastation works just as well. I just prefer Kalidor's because it actually pops them away from you, whereas Devastation is just raining down on them and causing absolute death and destruction if it hits, which is entirely a different question. But, you know, Devastation works in a lot of these for the same exact reasons Albrecht's Aether Ray works, or the same reasons Kalidor's Tempest works. So, I hope this helped you. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, what have you, please leave them down in the comment section below. Thank you all very much for joining me. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me, and have a great 24 hours.